Okay, welcome to the CEFACT Grid Project meeting. We are recording this meeting. There's a transcript that will be generated and the meetings will be published. We have, for those that are new, a kind of code of conduct and intellectual property rights approach to the work that we do for CEFACT. They're both publicly available. You can kind of happily, if you haven't seen before, share the links to these documents. They describe basically a royalty-free approach to what we produce as CEFACT. So we're kind of giving it away for free to public, is the general sort of terms. And the open development process is a published sort of document process. And in fact, in the open development process, we are now in public review, which is a particular milestone phase of the work we do for a project. So that hopefully that's okay with everybody. So just bear in mind, if you have intellectually kind of protected information, you don't need to share it with us, but if you do, then it becomes part of the record. Very exciting. Today's agenda, because we're in public review, we're going to sort of focus on the issues that were raised and how we're handling them, any new issues, the merge requests that have been generated, if there are open merge requests to be processed, and then we can talk about the kind of other things that are in flight, like pilots, related projects and emerging topics, and any other business. That's the sort of plan for today. Generally speaking, we try to make these last around 50 minutes in recognition that many people have a meeting at the next start of the next hour. We'll try and give you a bit of space for that. So we try not to run over unless it's such an interesting conversation and we can't stop ourselves. So with that, I will break out of the that form of that. I'll go back to here. So on it, we have a GitHub repository, which Keith, you're new. I don't know if you've seen this before. We're running basically a GitHub repo. I will, or someone else can share the link to this in the chat. It's a standalone instance of GitLab, actually, running on a UNICC compute space. So it's not gitlab.com, it's running on a UNICC space. But you're so therefore, if you've got a gitlab.com account, you'll need to kind of request to get an account on this UNICC space. But you should find that that's not as onerous as becoming a CEFACT expert if you're not one already. That's a circus exercise of hoops and jumps. So it's hopefully easier to get into this if you wish to, but it's publicly accessible. You can see the content that we're going to look at today anyway, even if you're not a sort of contributor to the repository. The repository generates web pages. So if I jump to here, the content that you might see as our grid.unece.org is all generated from the content that's on the repository in Markdown documents through DocuSource. That's the sort of process we use to manage content. I mentioned that we're in this process of public review that started a couple of weeks ago now. It will last until the 21st of September. In a sense, this project's always been open for public review. We've been soliciting, welcoming comments and suggestions from people from the start back in April of 2025. But this is a sort of more formal phase. And what it means is that hopefully we'll get meaningful, sufficient comments. We'll be able to address those, and then the CEFACT Bureau can say, okay, this phase, if you like, is finished. Now, what does that mean for this project? That's a really interesting question, because this project is defining this global registry information directory, the concept, if you like. If that concept becomes real, it means that there's an operating unit that needs to be instantiated, and it needs to do stuff, and it needs to exist. And this project doesn't make that bit happen. So what we're really doing is writing the documents that then would be used as the basis for a decision by CEFACT and the UN, I suppose, to say, do we want to stand this thing up? And so it's that sort of phasing that we're doing. So it's an important milestone for us. It means the documentation is sort of ready for serious review by those that may decide to create a grid or not. But it's not otherwise sort of, it's not, I guess, going to be otherwise. We won't create a grid just because we've reached the end of the public review period. It's a subsequent decision that's made. In parallel, we've got pilots that we're encouraging people to participate in, which is very pleased to see you, Kathy. So what we're doing is there are 3 channels to public review comments being received by the project. So if you look at our website, you'll see that we've got this sort of banner on every page that says public review guide. You can read this guide. It tells you a bit about what we're looking for, and you can click this link and you get a web form. You can submit feedback via an email. And the UNECE themselves have published a page on their site, which will give you the facility to sort of use a Word document. We had a fairly substantial set of comments from a guy called Chris Papp, who I actually haven't seen on these calls yet for a while, but he basically gave us the Word document format, which I took the email he sent me, which is this content here, and generated an issue into our issue log. So this is the email that he provided to us. And then what we basically did was take the Word document content and make it into a sort of markdown table so we can sort of look at it here. There are 5 substantive comments. They're like rows of this table. And then what we did was we took those 5 rows, that's issue number 68. We took those 5 rows and we kind of spawned off 5 child issues. And that's sort of where we are at right now. The other thing I've done from a housekeeping point of view for others is that we have new labels for issues where we can say this thing is public review comment and it's for discussion still. We're still talking about it. We haven't got a resolution, we don't think yet. And we've got ones where we think we're ready for review. So as a processing approach, I suggest look at the ready for review ones, and then we can look at the discussion ones because they'll take a bit longer. So in ready for review, did I just click on? I just did that. That was sort of sensible. Let's go to that one. Yeah, obviously, you can see just those labels that are ready for review. You can just see those labels that are open for discussion. You can do a number of ways of visualizing. So this comment was basically around the document that's called the Digital Identity, Legal Meaning and Data Structures. That's where we reason about the meaning of issuing a DIA. What does it mean legally? That was mostly Alina Nikogalis's work, my co-lead. She's on leave at the moment. It's as you well know, it's August and she's from Spain. So she'll be back, but it's August and it's Spain. The basic sort of thrust of Chris's comment was this idea that there are some inconsistent sort of issuance models, and he was looking at the content of the DIA legal meaning structure, the legal governance and target operating model. So we've created a separate document that says this is how the operating model should work for GRID if it exists, and we've got this pilot design and architecture. And he said, well, look, I'm a bit confused by the way DIAs are being issued. So I broke down that sort of comment and sort of explain sort of a few things. It's the fundamental position is that participants in the grid, UN member states who decide to participate in the grid who opt in, don't need to issue DIAs. It's not a requirement. It's an opportunity. They can do so, and we would encourage them to do so, but they don't have to do so to be a participant in the grid. We would need to allow states that are developing their digital maturity or may have other investments and do things other ways. We need to allow them to participate without forcing them to have to do other things like issue DIAs. But we do want to encourage them to issue DIAs. And we can, as GRID, also issue our own digital recognition of that member state that's participated, our own DIA. But to issue a DIA, we would require them to have a DID. Apologies if this is already sounding a bit confusing, but they would need to have a DID that we can put into the DIA that we recognize them with. That's the binding process. So basically, I've kind of gone through this and explained kind of how we would handle his thing, and I've basically made some changes to a branch, which is in this public review comment. So there's a couple of things that I sort of think, yes, you're right, we could tweak that, make it a bit clearer as to what we mean in these 3 separate documents, but I don't think there's a substantive need for change. So what you can do is, what I'm going to do is put the changes into this branch that we can look at as we go along to say, okay, those are all the changes. And the Sankashan suggestion is we wait maybe till the next 2 weeks from now, and then we sort of take a chunk of those and put them into the public updated version of the website, and then do another chunk later, so that we don't keep moving the website in sort of live. Yeah, we do it in batches. Does that all make sense so far? Yeah, cool.
Thanks, John. Thank you for taking the pain to explain all this. Thank you.
It's new to everybody else too, mate. I think more or less. So Sankashan's probably been seeing it a bit more than others, maybe. So that one I think is reasonably Okay, but what I encourage yourselves, and particularly those that haven't seen these before, is to please double check my suggestion, right? This is a collaborative work. So I would very much welcome other people looking at what I've suggested. If it's not me, or I will obviously review other people's work if they propose it, and only when we've got like a agreements do we kind of make the change to the content. That was one of the ready for reviews. This is another one. So this is an interesting comment from Chris, and it goes to quite an interesting kind of question. It's around the idea that so the grid is this thing that's running, and it's trying to verify registrars. So what we're doing as we're running as an operating unit is we're receiving updates from the registrars themselves. They're maintaining their own data. We're reading that data, and we're checking that they signed it with the signature that we expect them to, or the key that we expect them to sign it with. So we're checking the sort of data integrity through a cryptographic signature check. So that can realize a situation where we've seen data that they've got in the space we expect to find it, but they haven't signed it. So it could be kind of unverified. It's data that's there, but it's not signed by their signature. And equally, there could be a situation where a registrar isn't in the grid. And then it's kind of like not verified, but the grid doesn't know anything about them. So it has nothing to say about them, and somebody might be looking them up and so on. So he's sort of exploring this idea around the voluntary participation, what it means to be unverified by the grid. What Alina was doing, who crafted this legal text, was to, I guess, very clearly in a legal sense, to limit the meaning and scope of what it means if we verify and say, yes, you're a member of the grid, and if we don't. So she wanted to be quite clear about that thing. And I think that for Chris, that was a bit problematic. What I basically did was to clarify the text a bit more. If a non-participating registrar, so they're not part of the grid, is issuing DIAs, we can't validate this DIA. It's not part of our space, right? So then it becomes this idea about the relying party, which is a theme we've all pushed a lot, is responsible ultimately for deciding if they trust something or not. We can't take any responsibility for a thing we don't even issue, right? It would be kind of wrong and absurd for us to do so. So we sort of have to sort of make sure that we take responsibility for what we do. We can't take responsibility for what others do. So that's another one of the issues that I think is reasonably simple with a simple sort of clarification kind of thing to check. And then another sort of concept about authority to act. So here Chris is aware of, and I think his work has taken down a more complete model, I suppose, of supply chain participants. So the grid and the registry it creates is not doing much, to be honest. All it's doing is recognizing that a UN member state says this is our authoritative registrar for these things, and that's it, right? It doesn't do anything more than that. So the idea about authority to act of an entity, we don't really have anything to say about that, because what we put into the thinking about the grid is that every country, it sounds great, every country on earth, every UN member state has their own legal framework. And in their legal framework, they may define the authority to act of an organization somewhat differently to another person's legal framework in a different country. And that's their gift. That's the sovereign right of nations. So we can't dictate what it means in terms of authority to act. We've got a new person arriving. Can you bring him in, Joe? So basically on this one, I think my consideration was there was a minor change to make about clarifying, but again, it was more to do with clarifying the intent and not sort of a substantive change to the document. So that's what I'm basically doing, sort of reading and listening to interpreting what Chris has said and saying, okay, I think we can improve based on what you're saying on the basis of those. So those three are of that quality: minor change, improving the clarity of text. The other two are more interesting, if those weren't interesting enough, and we'll spend a bit of time with those. I'm going to hand over to Sankishan, just warming him up. So they go to, is this the long one? No, good. Okay, so there are two that are quite similar. They talk to this idea of life cycle of credentials, life cycle of recognition, life cycle of membership of the grid. What Chris's comment was a sensible comment. He realized that in the pilot participant guide, we hadn't suggested using the piece of information called a credential status block, which is if you're into the W3C's verifiable credential data model, there's a thing called the bit string status list, and it's a way of revoking and changing the status of a issued verifiable credential. Its origin is in the idea of things like driving licenses, say, where you might want in sort of real time to be able to say that this driving license that this person's holding has been potentially temporarily revoked. They've gone too many points, whatever else, and you want to be able to do this sort of thing without having to contact the issuer and do other things and so on. So this predates the 18013-5 ISO standard and everything else. It's a sort of a bit string status list. Now the bit string status list is quite powerful. It can be more than one bit for status, so it can be more than sort of a 0 or 1. It can be 2 bits. It can have 4 values, therefore, and you can create different types of meaning of these 4 values. So basically, Chris is saying we should include the credential status block. And there were 2 reasons why we didn't include it in the pilot. One, I'm lazy and I wanted to be simple. I just wanted the pilots to issue credentials. Sorry, don't whinge too much, hands. I just wanted the pilots to issue credentials and not have to worry yet about lifecycle. But actually, I think Chris is right. We do need to think about lifecycle because it is an important issue. But I don't think that the credential status bit, or bits even, if we make it more than 1 bit, is sufficient to manage the status of a lifecycle. And that comes up in another issue where I will then hand over to Sankishan, where I think it's number 75, yeah. So 75 has this trigger word, historical, and goes into withdrawal. And it was anticipating the problem where a registrar that's part of the grid kind of withdraws. What do we do about the keys? Do we keep them? What do we do about the information? Do we have a duty of care or so on data? There's a whole bunch of data retention rules to think about. So that started a kind of a similar train of thinking about lifecycle management and how do we do it. So Sankishan and I have been thinking about this. I've got a whole bunch of work off-grid, off-grid. It's another repo about thinking about credential life cycles. But Sankishan, can you give my voice a break and start talking about what you were thinking about in the issue?
Yeah. So there is a longish comment from me on that issue, and that part that specifically is about if at all grid was to consider handling this, the historical records, and go beyond the is this registrar a part of grid and be able to answer the question, as on this date was the registrar part of grid? What all things additionally we need to consider? I mean, effectively trying to encapsulate a simple question and what impact it has in terms of how we think about grid policies and what all stuff will need to happen in terms of data structure. So that's essentially what my comment is about. Now, that's the implementation level detail. I think the more interesting part is the term historical, because this has been discussed across every single instance of data registries that I'm encountering, and everyone has their own interpretation of it. And at some point in time, for grid, we need to figure out what exactly we need to do in terms of what is the minimum record if we really want to do it, or the very basic question, I think, does grid actually need to maintain a historical record? Do we really need to, or is it always current and we do not need to be bothered with history? The other part of this question is, should any local registrars or like UN member states implement their registries using grid-like software? This decision might also be adopted by them. So we end up setting some sort of a chain precedence of that. So that is all we are trying to discuss in this particular issue, just that we're using too many words and being too verbose about it. So I'm going to stop there.
Yeah, cool. Anybody have any initial sort of thoughts about this? It's there's a lot of Yeah, there's a lot of thinking we can share, but I'm kind of keen to hear of anybody that's sort of already gone through this process of thinking. Hans, as the work you've been doing with verifiable.trade, has that got that sort of consideration gone through your systems as well?
Yeah, partly yes. While I have to confess that I haven't read this, what I'm seeing here.
Okay, that's fine. That's fine.
It sounds very, very similar. However, cool. I don't believe that we have this moment of having to persuade 192 or 256 different authorities to keep their records.
That's a very good point. If we take the idea that we have no right to impose our will on other UN member states, if that's a principle, right? We can't tell them to keep your records for 7 years or 20 years or whatever. That seems to be too much of an imposition. What I think we can decide is, what does the grid do? How long does it keep it? And even then, the UN member states may say, if we decide to withdraw, we want you, like a right to be forgotten, we want you to delete the data about us.
Yes, we are on another level where a similar problem occurs. And this would be with the QVIs, the qualified VLEI issuers. Yep. They would need to have, or there would need to be some kind of a governance so that people who maintain or have been issued a VLEI credential would be able to rely on exactly this historization, because everything that is dealt with supported by a VLEI would be something that could potentially get to a court in order to be looked at, and the history would be assessed, and a court would need to look into a graph that has been written somewhere, and then reliability questions as to how that graph is written would come up. And then we're at the same historical or minimum historical record questions that are posed here.
Yeah.
However, it would not be a authoritative register, but someone doing something similar on their behalf. If I'm
I think that's good points, Hans. Joe?
I can't hear you, Joe. You're muted.
Sorry, yeah. I've been through this a couple of times with John, and I keep flip-flopping between the grid itself needs to be as little and as keep to its own purpose. Absolutely fair enough. And then the question is, okay, so if you take it at its basic, the grid has to prove, to Hans's point, non-repudiation of what was given to it by the registrar, and how that was reflected in the grid. That's basic. That's what the grid has to do, because otherwise we run the risk of the grid propagating a whole load of stuff that is incorrect, and that has to cover itself, right? So that is just basic technological audit associated with what happens in the grid. Then the question is, okay, does the grid have to reflect the historical outcome associated with the registrar? And at its basic capability, no, that's not the role of the grid. The grid is just to be useful, to publicize and enable the broader utilization of the registry. That's its purpose.
The registries, plural.
Yeah, registries, exactly right.
Right.
Well, the registry of registrars. That's not gonna. Anyway, too complicated. But anyway, so we've got to be absolutely clear that that's not its role. However, if a specific implementation of the grid decided that that was a capability that they wanted to be able to do.
Slow down for a second, Joe. That's what you've just said is a really important point, but we need to make sure the audience follows. Okay, so if we're talking about the UN CEFACT grid,
yeah,
that's a thing, right? There's the potential of grid patterns. Other organizations could create a separate instance running away and doing their thing. That
I was just about to ask that. Yeah, why are we talking about instances now?
That's entirely their own affair. If they do want to do that, that's cool. It's open source. You can go ahead. So I kind of want to make sure we, to avoid confusion with the audience, let's just focus on what does the UN CEFACT grid of UN member state registrars do.
Well, that's
but the interesting question that I now have to pose is: there is not going to be one grid, but there are instances of grids in your minds.
No,
there will be instances of grids because there'll be instances of contexts, say, land registries. Those sort of types of grids.
No, Joe, that's a different thing.
Well, that's a different thing as well, right?
No. So there is one grid to rule them all. No, that doesn't rule anything. There is a grid that is the UN CEFACT curated grid of UN member states that wish to participate. Each UN member state may have more than one registrar and registry that they wish to list, and they are going to be supply chain and commerce because it is UN CEFACT, and that's the only
registries about anything. Registries about legal entities, lands.
I answered that question, Hans, if you listen for a second. UN CEFACT is the commerce and trade body of the UN. It is interested in commerce and trade. Therefore, anything to do with commerce and trade, a registrar or registry of things to do with commerce and trade entities or things, is fair game. But it's not for us. We're not dictating. Remember, we are. What will happen for the grid is it'll be a member-driven organization. The UN member states who participate will decide what the grid does. If a UN member state says, I think we should include trademark registrars in the grid, okay. If a UN member state says we should include land registrars in the grid, okay.
Are these the instances that you've been talking about, or
no?
Can I understand?
They're not the instances. So an instance of the grid that is separate from the grid is something like Global ACI is a party I know quite well now. Global ACI is an international peak authority on national accreditation bodies. So UCAS, by the way, Kirthi, in the UK is part of Global ACI. In Australia, NATA is. In Germany, it's DAX. And these are all independent authorities, national authorities on accreditation, who are members of Global ACI. And Global ACI has does not answer to the UN, right? It's its own peak authority. It has no country that manages it or anything else, right? So Global ACI could choose to run a grid structure. They could choose to run something like a grid. It's up to them. This stuff will be open source standard things. They can, we won't stop somebody copying, if you like, the pattern. But it would not be the UN CEFACT's grid. It wouldn't be part of it unless a UN member state counterintuitively says we want to include national accreditation bodies in the UN CEFACT grid. And for me, that would be, well, you don't need to because there's a Global ACI. It's all a bit confusing now. So there's a sort of, in my mind, there's a single instance of grid under the UN CEFACT control, which has a number of different types of registrars and registries that they manage included. And those types are up to them to include. They're all supply chain relevant. They're to do with things like organizations and land and marine assets. And
one question here, please, if I'm allowed. What would be the rationale of a second or third or nth instance?
For us, we care and we don't care, right? A rationale can be, so if I use that accreditation body instance, okay, so those are independent authorities that decide whether to accredit a test lab as being capable of testing a product to a certain standard. That's their sort of role in life, right? In the UNTP space, the United Nations Transparency Protocol space, the results of a test lab testing a product to see whether it conforms to a standard is the issuance of a digital conformity credential, DCC. right? So when you look at the DCC kind of chain of trust, if you want to think of it that way, it goes through, was the lab accredited to test this product against the, their recognition there? Well, who accredited them? So it could be DAX, or it could be UCAS, or it could be NATA in Australia. Who says that DAX or NATA or UCAS is an accreditation body for that country? Well, in this instance, there's an existing body called Global ACI that does that. It already exists, and you can kind of look it up, but they could decide to run a grid-like structure, which would then allow UNTP as a protocol to operate in sort of more than one dimension, not just up to the grid that's run by CEFACT, but to an instance of the grid run by Global ACI. It's up to them. We're not dictated. They could choose, right?
I believe I get it now. So the grid would be kind of a template for registries of registries,
Yes.
a template for a register of registries.
Exactly right.
Yes, whatever you want the registries to perform.
Yeah.
Right. Good, understood.
The question you raised, though, John, is, or actually, I think it was Hans. What would be the purpose for having multiple instances of the grid, right? Now, there might be practical reasons for having multiple instances of the grid, maybe different versions of them, different contexts, different this and the other. At this stage, it's a model, right? Even under UN CEFACT, we could have multiple instances that actually cater for different protocols, different mechanisms, and so forth. They may be different physical instances, which do different things and cover different registry types. But the model is the model. Now, I think what we're saying is the question is whether, in fact, the specifications and the documentation at the moment implies that there is a single instance, always a single instance, or not. And I'm not sure that I've actually read that in the documentation.
So I want the document. I'm not saying it does, right? But I want the documentation that exists at the moment on our web pages, and you're seeing a bit on the screen with the issue, to solely describe a single instance of grid. That is its only purpose.
Physical instance.
If a separate organization decides they want to copy the grid structure.
No, I'm thinking about under UN CEFACT, right?
No, I don't even want to go there, Joe. I really don't, because it will confuse people. I want to keep the grid a single thing, because it's hard enough to get people to understand the single thing. If you start saying, "Oh, we could have lots of them," and it just spins people into the ether more. So we need to sort of keep it simple, and there is a reason why it was and is a good idea to have a single grid for that sort of peak thing, for the things that the grid is interested in, which could be multiple different types. It makes it simpler for us to manage and to convince people about. Sankashan.
I have a simple question. So, and hear me out a bit. So this is a model and a software that is being developed under the umbrella of the UN at this point in time. But the software or whatever gets developed is going to be open source, right? So which means that it prevents no one on earth to take that code base, create their version of a registry of information, which adheres to the model and pattern that was developed under the UN. UN runs an instance of that software and calls it grid. A member state could run an instance of their software and call it mesh for all we care, and it will serve a different context and all of that. And it might also so happen that the member state says that, oh, here is my mesh that I'm going to link up to grid, and you guys figure out how data will be exchanged and queried across them, if at all. This is eventually that might happen, right? That is how it is. But our current concern is the software that is, or the model that is grid, being run and operated by somehow under the umbrella of the UN or UN CEFACT, and that is the UN CEFACT grid is what we are talking about at this point in time. Is that correct?
It is correct, and exactly right, and hopefully not making that good explanation worse. I'll try and add an example, right? So one of the ways that the UNTP protocol, which after all grid is a kind of supporting element of the UNTP protocol, one of the things it tries to allow is this idea of what they call a transparency graph. So we had an instance in Australia of a program on TV about our tomato paste, declaring itself to be Australian tomato paste made from Australian tomatoes. Apparently has Chinese tomatoes in it. Big issue, right? It's a big issue for a whole bunch of reasons, but it's an interesting case from a supply chain point of view. So if we imagine we're trying to go from a digital product passport about a can of tomato paste, and we're trying to sort of follow up. So, okay, this says it was made by this company. Who supplied the tomatoes? Where did the tomatoes get processed, et cetera, et cetera. We're following it up, right? We're doing a kind of like a says who kind of thing. Eventually, if you follow the chain up through UNTP and you're asking about organizations, who registered this organization, declares itself to be an Italian organization, who registers organizations in Italy, and is that registrar recognized by the grid? Now, at this point, you've got to, following the daisy chain kind of bouncing ball thing, you're now at a point where you're at a UN controlled domain, and DIDA did, saying, okay, it's the UN that recognizes this member state and recognizes then the registrar that they've said is the registrar. So we kind of got up to, okay, that seems to be believable then. Whereas if they've created a separate instance, you've ended up at Global ACI, for example, then you need to know that Global ACI is in fact the international authority on national accreditation bodies, which they happen to be. But that's sort of a different level of understanding about authority and meaning of the says who thing. So for our grid, the one that Sankar was describing, it comes to the point where you can see it was signed by the UN or a body of the UN. Okay.
That is not a question. That is not an answer to Sankarshan's question, I believe.
I was elaborating on Sankarshan's point. I was hopefully I said I hope I didn't make it worse, because Sankarshan made a good simple point. I may have made it muddy.
Yeah, Sankarshan, I did like your question, which made me think into other directions.
Okay,
It goes into the direction of the open source license model that is behind the grid. Is that rather a permissive license, or is it a copyleft license? So if I choose to use artifacts that this project has produced or are a result of the project, of the conceiving power of the project, am I free to use that?
Yep.
And do I have to give back what I produce into the community?
So the IPR rules that we operate under from a project point of view, from an open development program point of view, are fairly. They're not like they don't cite Apache or GPLs or whatever. They're not quite that explicit, but they do talk about royalty free and free to use, no license constraints and so on. So they use a general description of the quality of the license rather than a specific instance of you must use CC BY-SA or GPL Apache, whatever. They don't sort of go do that. But you're right, Hans. The principle is, and as Sankarshan said, anybody theoretically could take a copy of this code, spin up their own instance, and off they go.
No, more. Develop the code further. Does it have to be back into the grid project? Or
no, I don't think there's any. Yeah. You could take it and run. So in a sense, crikey, how does that make sense? It makes sense because the UN isn't trying to create a fortified moat around a proprietary business model, right? That's not its business. It makes sense because it's not in that kind of business, right? It's possible, therefore, that companies might take the grid, add some extra bits to it, and then say, I've got this U-Butte way of managing registry data, and try and charge for it. I don't know that we would have an easy way of protecting ourselves against that. It's sort of. It's not I don't think it's a problem that the UN is normally used to protecting itself against.
No.
But it's in a sense you'd say, well, that shows it's a really good idea. But the thing, remember, the reason the UN has this unique position. So you're often in sales situations talking about unique value propositions and defensibility of an idea, right? There is only one UN, and the UN is the body that recognizes countries. So there is no other authority that recognizes countries yet. I mean, I know people are talking about spinning up a different various other things, but at the moment there is only one UN. And it recognizes countries, and that's its unique gift. And therefore, you can kind of go down from there to, well, if the UN runs a grid, it's a unique grid. And others may exist for reasons that are useful. You could say that work of organizations like Life are grid-like, and they serve a really good purpose, and they should make money, and they should be sustainable, and it's all good. But it's a different thing, right? There could be to the point Joe was saying, there could be more than one grid.
Yeah, but it also brings up an interesting twist to this issue that we have on screen, which is implementations like Live have a necessity of maintaining the historical perspective of record. The question that we need to come back to is, does the UN CEFACT grid also have that same necessity? If it doesn't, then the life cycle issue. Yes, Hans, go ahead.
If there's no history kept, and we're trying to build something that people rely on in their daily legal encounters or legally valid encounters, if we haven't got a history, it's useless.
Yes. So my request,
because no court will ever come and say, you've given me sufficient evidence of what has happened in the past.
Yeah.
And I make a decision. In contrast, they will say, I just don't know what happened between you.
True.
Forget about it. Go home. Yeah.
Like Joe, John and I have been going back and forth about how much of this is necessary, what is the minimum, and what needs to happen. So my request to everyone on this call is, please take a look at this issue. Figure out you must be doing work that relates in some way to this question. This is not a novel question at all. It comes up in every time one needs to store data. So please think through and figure out how best we can express this without coming across as, oh, every member state needs to adopt this, because that is something that's not going to fly, probably.
Joe?
Yeah, the problem we have is that not every use of the grid will work in the same way. And those that use the grid will use it for its own basic purpose. If we start creating historical mechanisms that have to work in certain ways, it could well be that they're not appropriate for what it is, all the different usages. So like John, I would actually keep to the grid as just a record of reflecting broadly a registrar's registration records that is easily accessible. And then the question about historical relevance or verifiability and relevance to the, if you like, the business context has to be the responsibility of the verifier and not the grid.
Yes. Yeah, that fundamental sort of axiomatic kind of thing, I think it has to stay true. So I on this issue, I absolutely agree with the sanction. Let's please read the issue and supporting information. There's quite a bit of work that people need to think about. A few quick, obvious observations. One, we have nothing about history in the current documentation. We have some dialogue about, in the target operating model document, it talks about how an eligible UN member state that's become a participant might cease to be eligible and what you might do about it. There's a sensible discussion that Alina's created around how the members of the grid would go through a process and so on. So it talks about the governance, if you like, about membership sort of suspension and other things. What it doesn't talk about is, okay, what do you do about the records then? How do you reflect this in the actual records that the grid has published and maintains and shows to people? So we need to fill a gap. It doesn't have anything in there at the moment about how we do this. So having nothing isn't good enough. We need to have something. What we say is kind of going to be up to us. in the first instance. We draft a suggestion about how the grid might handle history. And the reason I say it like that is that it's up to the operator of the grid ultimately to decide what they will commit to. So we're going to give them a draft, a blueprint. We think the grid should do this with history. Let's make up a thing that will keep 7 years. It actually may have to keep all years. I don't care, but it makes some statement about how many years are kept or what it has to do. Eventually, the operating authority for the grid will confirm or change or do something about the history, but it needs to have something to start with. And that's what we're doing. We're filling a blank at the moment that exists in our documentation. We need to say something about history and records management, which is great because we got a review comment that's really made us have to think about something. Have we worried you, Karthi?
No, John. I mean, I find this interesting. For me, it is more about dealing with the likes of Company House, and I'm even working with Bundesanzeiger in Germany. The point here is, okay, if you're going to keep historical record, you have to see how long-lived these entities are and how stable they are. And given that they're more likely to be more stable than, say, individual businesses, yes, which may or may not exist in time. So yeah, I think there is a fine balance, I would think, as to keeping how much of historical record you want.
That's such a good point. And so Joe used the word velocity of change, if you like. Velocity, the frequency of change is going to be very low, we would expect. Actually, to some extent, countries come and go, right? There's a very slow moving, but there is a change of countries. They come and go. And the registrars within the country may also come and go, again, quite slowly, but it might happen over time that a country decides they've got a new structure, they've got a new authority that looks after, they combine things, they do whatever. So these things happen, but you're very right, they happen relatively slowly. And the good news about that, I think, is that means if you imagine we were keeping data over, I don't know, as many years, 50 years, 100 years, it still wouldn't be that much data. It's probably less than one TikTok video in volume, right? It's not going to be a huge amount of volume of data that we have to manage. But it's important data and it needs to be right, but it's not an onerous burden to maintain.
Are you sure there's going to be TikTok in 50 years?
No, it's just using an example, yeah. But yeah, it's just not a large volume of data.
No, it's not a large volume, but in essence, looking backwards over how these things might evolve, we have to be able to say that something which was created in the old model, or the old configuration, is still valid today, or we say that it's not valid today and it needs to be reissued based on the current registrar, and that's a choice.
Yeah. So there's a query that I shared a query on the LinkedIn sort of post about this meeting. And that query was actually from the work I've been doing with NATA, the accreditation body. But we could probably better express that query with a tomato example about, was this company registered by the authoritative registrar for Italy 5 years ago, say? And if you want to be able to answer that question, sort of was company X registered by authority Y for country Y or whatever in time Z, you've got to have some handle on the history, and we can decide we don't want to manage that question, but we need to sort of think of it as a way of exploring what we have as a capability.
Yeah, unfortunately, all those three entities, should we say, can change.
Yeah, absolutely.
So all those scenarios are still up for discussion.
Yeah. Hans, what did you want to say? Sorry.
I was tempted to think out loud about how the information that we're talking about, which requires a minimum historical record, how that is being made part of a graph structure that writes what happens in a supply chain.
So,
and I don't know if you have the same imagination of what we are actually trying to achieve. That's sometimes difficult to come to same imaginations. But I buy something as a company, and I have a counterparty. Let them be in Indonesia, and this counterparty, I want to know who it is. So I'm tempted to have my algorithms look up the identifier, which is registered somewhere. And I want to make sure that this identifier is kind of accepted by a national authority.
Yeah. So you're right.
So is that going to be part of that graph that somebody else
So for one of the
reads as well?
So one of the suggestions from Sankashan, I think it's worth thinking about, is in a sense. So technologists, and I include myself in that bundle, often think of the happy path too often and forget about the complicated paths. Right? This is a sort of one of those complicated paths. So it's not just always about now. Is this now the state of things? Is this now a registered authority and a registered company and so on? It's a question about history, and I think that yes, there are. So in my mind, there are like layers to the graph, or there are different branches to the graph at different times, and you need to be able to express the query. Every query in my mind now has a time. In other words, when I'm asking, is this a valid thing? I need to give it a time at which I'm asking it, is it valid? Right, and that time could be now, and with a plus or minus sort of window of now, or it could be 5 years ago.
Well, if you're in a court, it's always past tense. It has it been true in whatever 2021 when that deal was made.
So there's a good reason. You're very right. There's a good reason why. But the thing, I guess, the grid is at the moment it doesn't exist. It's not part of the legal framework of. But
it's going to be. It's going to be. Otherwise, everything we do here is in vain.
I'm pretty confident it's going to exist, right? So then it does become part of that fabric for a legal proof and so on, and chains of evidence. So yes, I think it's an important question we need to resolve, this history idea. I want to quickly talk about pilots and other things, if that's okay. So the encouragement is please read this issue. We'll post some other stuff up about content that we've been thinking about how to handle this issue and how to put content in-house. So Alina is on leave at the moment, but she'll be back soon. She's running the Spanish pilot. So she's got a team apparently of people that can help implement it. If you haven't looked at the guidelines, there's a bunch of information about how to participate and how to do things and what you can do. So it can start quite simply. So with Alina, what I want to do is gradually help them build up the very, very lightweight sort of system that they need to have at their end that says, okay, this is the Spanish registrar independently providing some information that the grid is harvesting. This is the sign data, and just gradually build that up into a kind of fully functional system. We've got what we have at the moment in our sandbox are completely made up registrars. So these are functional in the sense that they're data that's retrieved from GitLab and GitHub repositories, and they're checked from a signature point of view. We should see green ticks at the far end of here. There you go. So they're cryptographically checked and so on, but they're just sandbox. They're not for real. So once we get Spain in, we've also got so Colombia, Brazil, and Uruguay under the Intra-American Development Bank are working on a solution, and we've reached out this week. We're in discussions with them. Hopefully we can get them into the discussion as well. Hopefully the UK, maybe. Who knows, on pilots.
We'll be happy to consider, John. Actually, I probably didn't tell you that there's considerable interest in the UK on UNTP and the work you're doing. Right now, I'm working on a MOD white paper on DPP, and they find this protocol quite interesting and the architecture quite interesting. Just last week, we Digital Catapult were thinking of piloting or sandboxing, creating a sandbox to test how this protocol works. From architecture perspective, it looks very impressive.
Cool.
Happy to. I'll take this conversation offline with you.
Brilliant. That's very encouraging. Yeah, it's designed to be as simple and lightweight to take up as possible, and there are quite a bunch. Certainly for UNTP, there's a bunch of tools that have been developed that should make it easier to adopt. So that's great to hear. Very encouraging. And so Steve Capel and I've got a kind of a campaign running right now about bringing in active participants as pilots. We've got a spreadsheet of lists of countries that are sort of prospects that we're working with. So we're very hopeful that by in the next few weeks and months, we'll actually have quite a few that are active participants. It'll be fantastic to have the UK in there. Cool. Okay, that was it. At the top of the hour now. So we're going to keep obviously encouraging people, all people on this call as well, of course. You can raise issues that are part of the public review, and we'll process them openly, transparently. And do think about the history thing. It's a great little brain teaser. Okay, all good.
All right. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you.
Take care.